Welcome, dear listeners, to a delightful tale of intrigue in the charming English village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea as we join the inimitable Miss Jane Marple, that gentle yet sharp-eyed observer of human nature, in a cozy mystery set amidst the festive cheer of the post-Christmas season. In the style of the classic whodunits you love, this story unfolds with clever clues, village gossip, and a satisfying unraveling of secrets. Enjoy Miss Marple and the Boxing Day Mystery. Chapter 1. The Discovery on Boxing Day Morning. The village of St. Mary Mead lay quietly under a delicate veil of frost on that Boxing Day morning in 1952. The excitement of Christmas had passed, leaving behind a gentle hush that seemed to settle over the thatched cottages and the neat gardens like a soft blanket. Church bells from St. Mary's had rung out cheerfully the day before. Carol singers had made their rounds and families had gathered around roaring fires with roast turkey and plum pudding. Now, on the 26th of December, the village returned to its usual rhythm. Tradespeople receiving their traditional Boxing Day gifts, children playing with new toys in the crisp air, and the occasional motor car chugging along the high street. In her pleasant little house near the center of the village, Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in her armchair by the sitting-room window, her knitting needles moving steadily as she worked on a pale blue bed jacket intended for the next church bazaar. Her white hair was neatly arranged, her pale blue eyes bright and observant behind her spectacles, and her expression was one of serene contentment. From her vantage point, she could see much of what passed in the street. The postman on his rounds, Mrs. Harmon from the vicarage hurrying to the shops with her basket, and young Leonard, the baker's boy, cycling rather too fast on his deliveries. Miss Marple's house was always immaculately tidy, with chintz curtains, a few good pieces of mahogany furniture inherited from her aunt, and a small collection of china dogs on the mantelpiece. On the table beside her stood a cup of tea, now almost cold, and a plate with the remains of a slice of Christmas cake. She enjoyed these quiet mornings when the world seemed to move at a gentle pace and there was time to think. The telephone bell rang sharply from the hall, breaking the stillness. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and rose with the unhurried grace of one who had never found haste necessary. She lifted the receiver. "Hello? St. Mary Mead, 331. Jane? Jane, is that you?" The voice at the other end belonged to her old friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, and it trembled with unusual agitation. "Oh, my dear, something perfectly dreadful has happened. You must come at once. It's Lucius, Colonel Hargreaves. He's dead, in the library, and it doesn't look at all natural." Miss Marple's expression did not alter greatly, but her eyes sharpened. "I shall come immediately, Dolly. Try not to distress yourself too much. I'll be with you in 10 minutes. She replaced the receiver, returned to the sitting room to collect her handbag and a warm woolen coat, and selected her most serviceable hat, the one with the small velvet bow. A few moments later, she stepped out into the frosty air, closing her gate carefully behind her, and set off at a brisk but ladylike pace towards Gossington Hall. Colonel Lucius Hargreaves had arrived at Gossington Hall on Christmas Eve, grumbling about the discomforts of modern railway travel and the exorbitant price of taxis. He was Dolly Bantry's cousin, a retired Indian Army officer in his 70s, tall and upright despite his age, with a bristling white mustache and a manner that suggested he still expected the world to jump at his command. He had spent many years in India, returning to England only after independence, and he was fond of recounting tales of the northwest frontier and the glories of the Raj, whether his listeners wished to hear them or not. Dolly Bantry, widowed some years earlier when her husband Colonel Arthur Bantry died, had invited the colonel for Christmas partly out of family duty and partly because Gossington Hall, though large, could feel rather empty at festive times. The colonel had accepted with a terse note, saying he supposed it would be better than spending the season alone in his London flat. As Miss Marple walked along the lane that led to the hall, she reflected on what she knew of the colonel. He had always appeared robust, though he complained incessantly about his digestion and the English climate. He was known to be comfortably off, with investments from his army pension and some family money, and he had no children of his own. His nearest relative was his nephew, Captain Roger Ainsworth, who had also been staying at the Hall for the holidays. Gossington Hall stood in its own grounds a little way outside the village proper, a handsome Georgian house with graceful proportions and a sweeping drive. When Miss Marple arrived, the front door was opened by Larter, the butler, whose usually impassive face wore an expression of controlled concern. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Mrs. Bantry is in the drawing-room. A very distressing business, if I may say so." "Thank you, Larter. Yes, indeed." Mrs. Bantry rose from her chair as Miss Marple entered. She was a plump, amiable woman with untidy gray hair and kind eyes now red-rimmed from recent tears. "Oh, Jane, thank heavens you've come. I simply don't know what to think. It's too awful." "Tell me exactly what happened, Dolly dear." "It was Gladys, the housemaid. She took the post into the library as usual this morning, about 8:30. And there he was, sitting in the big armchair by the fireplace, just as though he'd fallen asleep. Only he was dead. Dr. Haydock's with him now. He says it was poison." "Poison?" Miss Marple's voice was calm. "Yes, cyanide, he thinks. There was a glass beside him with a queer smell, bitter almonds, he called it. The decanter was there too, and the soda siphon. Lucius often had a nightcap before bed, but why would he?" Mrs. Bantry's voice trailed away. "Shall we go and see?" suggested Miss Marple gently. They proceeded to the library, a spacious room lined with books that the late Colonel Bantry had acquired more for appearance than for reading. Tall windows looked out over the wintry garden, and a fire had been laid but not lit. In the large leather armchair facing the hearth sat Colonel Hargreaves, his head slumped forward, his hands resting limply on the arms of the chair. His face had a curiously rigid look, the skin slightly bluish. Dr. Haydock, the village doctor for many years, straightened up as the ladies entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, good morning. Afraid it's rather grim?" "Definitely cyanide poisoning, rapid and lethal. He can't have suffered much, poor chap." On the small table beside the chair stood a heavy cut glass tumbler containing a small amount of amber liquid, a crystal decanter half full of whiskey, and a soda siphon. A notebook lay open on the colonel's lap, and near the fireplace a waste-paper basket held a crumpled sheet of paper. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes took in every detail. She noticed that the French windows leading to the terrace were very slightly ajar, allowing a thin draft to stir the curtains. The fire had burned low and died during the night. The colonel's heavy signet ring glinted on his finger, and his old regimental tie was slightly askew. "Has anyone telephoned the police?" she asked quietly. "Yes," said Dr. Haydock. "They'll be here shortly. Inspector Slack, I expect." Mrs. Bantry gave a small shudder. "Inspector Slack always makes me feel as though I've done something wrong." Miss Marple moved closer to the table. She did not touch anything, but she observed the faint residue in the glass and the untouched soda siphon. Colonel Hargreaves, she remembered, had always insisted on soda with his whiskey. Never drank it neat. She noticed, too, the faint scuff marks on the polished floor near the French windows, as though someone had entered or left in a hurry. At that moment, the sound of a car crunching on gravel announced the arrival of the police. A mystery, thought Miss Marple as she stepped back to allow the officer's entry, had come once again to the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. And on Boxing Day, of all days. Chapter 2. The house guests and their alibis. Miss Marple remained in the library only long enough to satisfy herself that she had observed all that was immediately visible. She had no wish to interfere with the police, who were already bustling about with measuring tapes and cameras. Inspector Slack, a brisk, humorless man with a high opinion of his own methods, greeted her with a curt nod that barely concealed his irritation at the presence of an elderly lady whom he considered an amateur busybody. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said. "Mrs. Bantry's friend, aren't you? No need for you to trouble yourself further. We'll handle this." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Of course, Inspector. I only came because Dolly was upset. I shall leave you to it." She withdrew to the drawing room, where Dolly Bantry sat twisting a handkerchief in her hands. The large room, with its faded chintz and family portraits, felt colder than usual despite the fire burning in the grate. "Who would do such a thing, Jane?" Mrs. Bantry whispered. "Lucius could be difficult. He was used to having his own way, but poison, it's too dreadful to think about." "Tell me about the house party, Dolly," Miss Marple said gently, settling herself in a chair. "Who was staying here over Christmas?" Mrs. Bantry drew a shaky breath. "Well, there was Lucius himself, of course. Then his nephew, Captain Roger Ainsworth. You remember him. He came down from Malaya last year. Such a charming man, though I fear he's been rather unlucky with his investments. Then Miss Evelyn Pritchard, a second cousin of Arthur's. She's been staying a fortnight doing some family research in the muniment room. Very keen on genealogy. And Mr. Timothy Black, Lucius's secretary, a quiet young man who came with him from London. Oh, and Lydia Swettenham. You know Lydia from the village. She came for Christmas dinner and stayed the night because it was so late when we finished cards." Miss Marple nodded. 5 guests besides Dolly herself and the usual staff. Larder the butler, Mrs. Eccles the cook, and the 2 maids. "Were there any disagreements?" she asked delicately. Mrs. Bantry hesitated. "Lucius did rather dominate the conversation. He and Roger had words on Christmas Eve, something about money, I think. Roger wants to put capital into his rubber plantation, but Lucius thought it risky. And Evelyn had been asking Lucius awkward questions about the family tree, something about his time in India. He didn't like it at all. As for Lydia, well, Lucius accused her of revoking at bridge. Quite loudly, I'm afraid. He had a sharp tongue when he chose." At that moment, Larder entered to announce that Inspector Slack wished to speak to the guests in turn. One by one, they assembled in the morning room, a smaller, sunnier apartment overlooking the rose garden, now bare and frosty. First came Captain Roger Ainsworth. He was a well-set-up man in his early 40s with tanned skin, a ready smile, and an easy manner that made him popular in the village. He wore a tweed jacket and looked, Miss Marple thought, a little strained about the eyes. "I can't believe it," he said, shaking his head. "Uncle Lucius was in fine form yesterday, grumbling as usual, but nothing out of the ordinary. We all went to bed fairly early. I'd had a cigar in the garden. Around 11, then turned in. Heard nothing until the maid screamed this morning." Miss Marple noted that his shoes, placed neatly by the hall stand, were perfectly clean and dry. No trace of the frosty dew that would have clung to them had he walked outside the previous night. Next was Miss Evelyn Pritchard, a thin, angular woman of about 50 with pince-nez and a precise manner. She carried a large notebook which, she explained, contained her genealogical notes. "Colonel Hargreaves was in the library when I retired at 10:30, she said crisply. "I had been working in the muniment room and passed through to say good night. He was writing letters. I went straight to my room and read until midnight or later." I heard nothing unusual. Her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened on the notebook. Timothy Black followed, a pale young man with spectacles and a nervous habit of pushing his hair back from his forehead. He had the look of someone perpetually anxious. "I worked late in the study," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The colonel wanted some accounts typed up. I left him in the library at about 12:30. He was perfectly well then." He said he would have one more whiskey and go to bed. I went up immediately afterwards. Miss Marple observed that his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Last of the guests was Mrs. Lydia Swettenham, a handsome widow in her late 40s with carefully waved hair and a fondness for bright colors. Even in tragedy, she managed to look elegant in a red woolen dress. "Poor Colonel Hargreaves," she said with a sigh. "We played bridge until quite late, nearly midnight. He was rather cross because he thought I'd miscounted trumps, but it was all in fun. I sat in the morning room for a little while playing patience, then went to bed. I sleep very soundly, I'm afraid. I heard nothing at all." Inspector Slack, having taken notes, dismissed them with a warning not to leave the house until further notice. The guests dispersed quietly, each to their own thoughts. Miss Marple lingered in the hall, where Larter was polishing silver as though nothing had happened. A sure sign, she thought, of a well-trained servant. "Larter," she said softly, "did anyone go to the library after midnight?" The butler paused. "I couldn't say for certain, miss. I locked up at 11 as usual and went to my pantry, but the French windows in the library are sometimes left unbolted. The colonel liked to let the dogs out late if they were restless." "And were the dogs restless last night?" "No, miss, they slept in the kitchen." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped outside for a moment onto the terrace. The frost still lay thick on the grass, and there, beneath the library's French windows, she saw faint impressions, footprints, small and neat, leading both to and from the house. They had been partially obscured by the gardener's early sweeping, but enough remained to show that someone had entered or left by that route during the night. She returned indoors just as Dr. Haydock emerged from the library. "Definite cyanide," he confirmed quietly. "Probably in the whiskey. Quick, at least. The police will send the glass for analysis, but there's no doubt." Miss Marple nodded. "And the time of death?" "Between midnight and 4, I'd say. Rigor is well advanced." As she prepared to walk back to the village, Miss Marple's mind was busy. 5 people with opportunity, several with possible motive, and those footprints, too small for Captain Ainsworth or Mr. Black, perhaps the size of Miss Pritchard's or Mrs. Swettenham's sensible shoes. The peaceful Christmas interlude was over. A murderer walked among the guests of Gossington Hall, and Miss Marple felt certain that the quiet village of St. Mary Mead would soon be buzzing with whispers and speculation. Chapter 3. Village Whispers and Hidden Clues. By midday, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead like ripples across a pond. Miss Marple, having left Gossington Hall with a promise to return later, paused at the post office to collect a parcel of wool and quite naturally to listen. Mrs. Blade, the postmistress, was in full flow behind the counter serving a small queue of villagers who had suddenly remembered urgent errands. "Poison, they're saying," she announced in a penetrating whisper that carried to the far corner. "Cyanide in his whiskey. Poor Colonel Hargreaves. Found cold as ice in the library this morning. Mrs. Bantry's beside herself." Miss Price, the district nurse, leaned forward eagerly. "I heard he'd had words with that nephew of his, Captain Ainsworth, something about money. They say the captain's lost everything in Malaya and was pressing the old gentleman for a loan. And that secretary," added Mrs. Blade, handing over a book of stamps with relish. "Mr. Black always looked shifty to me, pale as milk and forever twitching. Mark my words, there's more to him than meets the eye." Miss Marple paid for her wool and slipped quietly out, but not before noting that the village had already divided itself into camps. Those who favored the nephew as villain, those who suspected the secretary, and a small but vocal group who thought the colonel had taken his own life out of sheer ill temper. She walked on to the vicarage, where the Reverend Leonard Harmon and his wife were just finishing luncheon. Mrs. Harmon, a kind-hearted woman with a passion for good works, welcomed her warmly. "Miss Marple, have you heard the dreadful news?" Come in and have a cup of coffee. We were just talking about it." Over coffee in the cozy sitting room, Miss Marple learned a little more. The vicar had called at Gossington Hall on Christmas afternoon with a small gift of homemade mince pies. Colonel Hargreaves seemed in boisterous spirits, Mr. Harmon recalled. He complained about the mince pies being too rich for his digestion, but he ate 3 all the same. He was boasting about his Boxing Day boxes. Said he intended to be generous this year, especially to the staff. "Time to put my affairs in order," he said rather oddly. Mrs. Harmon lowered her voice. "And there was a letter delivered, special delivery just as we were leaving. No stamp, handwritten envelope. The colonel took it and frowned most awfully, then stuffed it in his pocket." Miss Marple's mild eyes brightened. "Did you happen to notice the handwriting?" "Small and neat, almost like a woman's," said the vicar, "but smudged, as though posted in haste." From the vicarage, Miss Marple proceeded to the High Street, where she encountered young Billy Stock, the gardener's boy from Gossington Hall, loitering outside the butcher's. "Good morning, Billy. Sad business at the hall." The boy nodded vigorously. "Yes, miss. Mr. Larder says we're not to gossip, but everyone's talking. I was up early sweeping the terrace. There were footprints under the library windows leading in and out, small ones like a lady's." "Indeed," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And did you notice anything else?" Billy hesitated, then confided, "I saw Mr. Black burning papers in the incinerator late last night. After everyone had gone to bed, looked like account books or something, flames shot right up." Thanking the boy, Miss Marple continued her walk, pausing at the Blue Boar for a glass of milk, her excuse for a quiet word with the landlord, Mr. Polk. "Busy Christmas, Mr. Polk?" "Very quiet, miss, until today. Captain Ainsworth was in on Christmas Eve, stood himself a whiskey and looked worried. Said something about family obligations weighing heavy. Then Mrs. Swetnam came in yesterday afternoon for her usual sherry, mentioned the colonel had been quite impossible at bridge and accused her of sharp practice. She laughed it off, but her eyes were sharp. Miss Marple sipped her milk and considered. Motives were beginning to take shape. Money for the captain, possible disgrace for the secretary, wounded pride for Mrs. Swetnam, and something, perhaps from the past, for Miss Pritchard and that mysterious letter. Returning home for a light luncheon of soup and toast, Miss Marple sat by her window and reviewed what she had learned. She had, earlier that morning, quietly retrieved the crumpled letter from the wastepaper basket in the library while Inspector Slack was occupied elsewhere. It now lay smoothed out in her handbag. The single sheet read in small, neat handwriting, "You know what you did in Simla in 1928. Justice may be slow, but it will find you. Beware Boxing Day." No signature, only those ominous words. Simla, 1928. Miss Marple's mind traveled back. She had a niece who had been in India then, and letters full of gossip. There had been a scandal involving a young officer, accusations of misconduct over a will or perhaps an affair. The name Hargreaves had been mentioned. Nothing proven, of course, such things were hushed up in those days. But memories lingered, and Boxing Day. Why specify that date? Some significance, clearly. The telephone rang again. It was Dolly Bantry, sounding a little steadier. "Jane, the police have finished in the library for now. Could you come back? I feel I shall go mad sitting here alone with my thoughts. And Inspector Slack wants to speak to everyone again this afternoon." Miss Marple promised to return after luncheon. As she finished her soup, she noticed something else she had pocketed from the library. A tiny scrap of ash-gray residue caught on the hearth rug near the colonel's chair. Not ash from the fire, but finer, almost like the remains of burnt photographic paper. She placed it carefully in an envelope. Cyanide, Dr. Haydock had said. and old photographic kits often contained potassium cyanide for fixing solutions. Miss Pritchard, with her passion for family history, might well possess such a kit for copying old documents. Or perhaps someone else. The village clock struck 2. Miss Marple donned her coat once more and set off again for Gossington Hall, her mind busy sorting the threads of motive, opportunity, and those small, everyday details that so often betrayed the truth. By the time she reached the drive, the frost was beginning to melt in weak afternoon sunshine, and the footprints Billy had mentioned were already fading. But Miss Marple had seen them, and she had read the letter, and she knew that the quiet murder in the library was rooted in something older and deeper than a mere Christmas quarrel. Chapter 4. The shadow falls on the nephew. The following morning dawned gray and chill, with a threat of rain in the heavy sky. Miss Marple, having passed a thoughtful night, arrived early at Gossington Hall, armed with a jar of homemade calf's foot jelly for Dolly Bantry and a quiet determination to observe developments. Inspector Slack had wasted no time. By breakfast, he had received preliminary reports from the police laboratory confirming cyanide in the whiskey glass and traces in the decanter itself. The time of death was fixed more precisely between midnight and 2 o'clock. Most damning of all, a small bottle labeled "rat poison contains cyanide" had been discovered hidden behind books in Captain Roger Ainsworth's bedroom. Captain Ainsworth was summoned to the morning room, where Inspector Slack confronted him with the evidence. "This is yours, I believe, Captain." The inspector held up the bottle in a gloved hand. Roger Ainsworth stared at it, genuine astonishment on his face. "I've never seen it before in my life. Rat poison? Good Lord, we don't have rats at the plantation house, and certainly not here." "Convenient," said Slack dryly. "Your uncle refused to advance you money for your failing business. You quarreled openly on Christmas Eve. You claim to have walked in the garden late at night, yet your shoes are clean. And now this bottle is found in your room. It looks very black, Captain." Miss Marple, who had been invited to remain as Mrs. Bantry's companion, watched the scene with quiet attention. The captain's bronzed face had paled, but his voice remained steady. "I did not poison my uncle, Inspector. Someone is trying to make it appear so." "And who might that be?" Slack demanded. Ainsworth hesitated. "I lent my heavy coat, the military greatcoat hanging in the hall, to Mr. Black last night. He said he felt the cold and wanted to step outside for air. Perhaps—" Timothy Black was fetched immediately. He denied borrowing the coat, though his cheeks flushed. Miss Marple noted that he avoided looking directly at the captain. The gardener, summoned next, added fuel to the fire. "I saw a figure in a long coat near the library windows about midnight, sir. Couldn't see the face, but tallish, like the captain." Inspector Slack rubbed his hands together with satisfaction. "Seems clear enough. We'll need you to come to the station, Captain Ainsworth, to make a formal statement." Dolly Bantry was distraught. "Roger? It can't be. He's always been so charming." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her friend's arm. "We must not jump to conclusions, Dolly dear. Things are sometimes planted to deceive." After the captain had been driven away in the police car, Miss Marple asked permission to look again at the library. The room had been sealed overnight, but Larder unlocked it for her. She moved slowly about, her eyes missing nothing. The French windows still showed faint traces of disturbance on the sill, a smudge of mud perhaps from a shoe. The wastepaper basket had been emptied by the police, but she recalled the crumpled anonymous letter perfectly. On the hearthrug, she noticed something new, a single dark thread caught in the fringe. It was coarse wool, the color of the captain's greatcoat. Yet if the coat had been worn by Mr. Black, as the captain suggested— She bent to examine the small table. The soda siphon remained untouched, its lever in the same position as yesterday. Colonel Hargreaves had always mixed his own drinks, insisting on a precise measure of soda. Whoever had prepared the fatal glass had not known or had forgotten that habit. Miss Marple stepped out onto the terrace. The rain had begun, a soft drizzle that was rapidly washing away any remaining footprints. She stood for a moment, visualizing the scene. Someone entering or leaving in haste, perhaps carrying the bottle now planted in the captain's room. Back indoors, she encountered Miss Pritchard in the hall, carrying her notebook and looking agitated. "Such a shocking business," Miss Pritchard said sharply, "though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Colonel Hargreaves had enemies." "From the past, you mean?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Miss Pritchard's lips tightened. "Certain actions in India were questionable. I uncovered documents only last week. He was furious when I mentioned them." "Documents concerning Simla in 1928? Miss Pritchard started. "How did you—" "Yes, a matter of a will and a young woman. Nothing was ever proved, but reputations suffered." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The anonymous letter had done its work, stirring old guilts and new suspicions. In the drawing room, she found Mrs. Swetnam sipping coffee with Dolly. "Poor Roger," Mrs. Swetnam said with a dramatic sigh. "So handsome and now in such trouble. Though between ourselves, Dolly, he did rather press the colonel about money. I heard them in the billiard room, voices quite raised." Dolly looked uncomfortable. "Family matters, Lydia." Of course, Mrs. Swetnam's bright eyes gleamed. "Still, poison is so melodramatic. One expects it in novels, not in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yet here it is. And the bottle found so conveniently. Almost too conveniently, one might think." Mrs. Swetnam raised an eyebrow. "Meaning someone wished to throw suspicion on Roger?" "Meaning," said Miss Marple, "that we must look beyond the obvious. Captain Ainsworth may be in difficulty, but difficulty is not the same as guilt." That afternoon, the village buzzed with fresh gossip. Captain Ainsworth had been formally detained. The bottle, it was said, bore faint fingerprints, smudged, but possibly his. The captain's financial troubles were common knowledge. Telegrams from his bank had arrived only yesterday confirming substantial overdrafts. Miss Marple took tea in her own sitting room, knitting steadily while her mind turned over the facts. The planted bottle was crude, too crude for a clever man like the captain if he were guilty. The untouched soda siphon was significant. The dark thread on the hearthrug might belong to the greatcoat, but greatcoats are often lent or borrowed. And there was Mr. Black's nervousness, Miss Pritchard's discoveries, Mrs. Swetnam's sharp tongue. She recalled a similar case years ago in the village, a poisoned cake meant to incriminate a rival. The real culprit had been the quiet one no one suspected. The rain pattered against her window. Inspector Slack was satisfied with his arrest, but Miss Marple was not. The shadow had fallen on the nephew, yet she felt certain it was cast by someone standing elsewhere, someone who had watched and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The mystery was deepening, and the true murderer, she suspected, was growing confident. That, in Miss Marple's experience, was when mistakes began. Chapter 5. The Secretary's Secret. The rain that had threatened all morning settled into a steady downpour by the afternoon, drumming on the windows of Gossington Hall and turning the drive to mud. Captain Ainsworth remained at the police station protesting his innocence while Inspector Slack pursued his inquiries with renewed vigor. Yet even he could not ignore the growing murmur of doubt. The fingerprints on the cyanide bottle were smudged beyond identification, and the label appeared suspiciously new. Miss Marple, sensing the tide beginning to turn, spent the morning quietly in the drawing room with Dolly Bantry, knitting a comforting pair of bed socks while listening to the household's subdued comings and goings. Timothy Black, The colonel's secretary had become noticeably more withdrawn. He took his meals in his room, pleading a headache, and was seen only when summoned by the police. Miss Marple observed him from the landing as he descended for yet another interview. Pale, spectacles slightly askew, fingers perpetually twisting a handkerchief. In the library, now released by the police for ordinary use, Miss Pritchard sat at the desk copying entries from an old family Bible, her movements precise and hurried. Mrs. Swettenham had retired to the morning room with a novel, though she turned few pages. At luncheon, served early and quietly in the dining room, conversation was strained. Dolly Bantry made a valiant effort to speak of ordinary things, the church flowers, the weather, but her voice faltered. After the meal, Miss Marple suggested a short walk in the covered loggia that ran along the back of the house. Dolly agreed gratefully, and the two old friends paced slowly beneath its shelter while rain dripped from the eaves. "Jane," Dolly said at last, "I can't believe Roger did it. He's always been so fond of the old colonel in spite of their differences. But if not Roger, then who?" Miss Marple paused, looking out over the sodden garden. Someone who knew the colonel's habits intimately, yet made a small but telling mistake. Someone with a stronger motive than mere inheritance. Dolly shivered. "You mean Timothy Black? He's such a mouse of a man." "Mice," said Miss Marple mildly, "can be driven to desperation." That afternoon, Inspector Slack returned with a warrant to search Mr. Black's room more thoroughly. Within an hour, he emerged triumphant, holding a bundle of papers rescued from the ashes of the garden incinerator. "Accounts," he announced. "The colonel's investment records, large sums transferred irregularly to an account in Mr. Black's name. Embezzlement plain and simple." Timothy Black was brought downstairs white and trembling. Confronted with the evidence, he collapsed into a chair. I meant to pay it back," he stammered. "It was only small amounts at first. Gambling debts, the horses, then it grew. The colonel found out on Christmas Day he'd asked for a full statement. He said unless I repaid every penny by the new year, he'd prosecute. I couldn't. I simply couldn't." "And so you poisoned him," Slack said heavily. "No!" Black cried. "I swear I didn't. I burned the papers, yes, panic, but I never touched the whiskey." When I left him at 12:30, he was alive and writing in his notebook. He said he had something important to finish before morning. Miss Marple, who had been quietly present, spoke for the first time. "What was he writing, Mr. Black?" The secretary passed a shaking hand over his forehead. I think it was his will, or a codicil. He muttered something about a Boxing Day revelation and doing justice at last." Inspector Slack seized on this eagerly. "So you knew he was changing his will, perhaps cutting you out entirely. Motive enough." Black shook his head miserably. "He'd already threatened exposure. I had nothing left to lose." Miss Marple's eyes rested thoughtfully on him. The young man was clearly terrified, but was it guilt or merely fear of disgrace? Later, in the quiet of the library, she asked Larder to bring her the colonel's notebook, which the police had returned. It lay on the desk where the colonel had left it, open at a page of cryptic jottings. Names, dates, sums of money. On the last page, in the colonel's bold handwriting, were the words, "Boxing Day, envelopes prepared. Truth to be told, heir in India to receive fair share, codicil enclosed." Miss Marple closed the book gently. So the colonel had intended a revelation, perhaps concerning the old Simla scandal Miss Pritchard had unearthed. A secret child, or grandchild to be acknowledged at last. She recalled the maid Gladys's evidence given earlier to the police, that around 1 o'clock she had been awake with toothache and heard raised voices from the library. A man's gruff tones and briefly a higher, sharper one that might have been a woman's. Suspicion now swung sharply towards Timothy Black. The embezzlement provided a powerful motive, the burnt papers an attempt at concealment, and his late interview with the colonel placed him in the library at a critical time. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. The untouched soda siphon still troubled her. The colonel had poured his own nightcap. Someone who knew him well would have known he always added soda. The poison had been in the whiskey neat, a mistake a stranger might make, but surely not his own secretary. And those small footprints under the French windows, Mr. Black wore size 9 shoes, she had noticed. The prints had been narrower, lighter. She sat in the colonel's chair, gazing at the cold hearth. A faint scent lingered. Not the colonel's tobacco, but something floral, elusive. Perfume, perhaps. Mrs. Swetnam favored a rather distinctive French scent. Or was it Miss Pritchard's lavender water? The rain had eased to a drizzle. Miss Marple rose and went to the window. From here, the view stretched to the summer house, now shuttered for winter. Tomorrow, she decided, she would speak to the maids more fully. Servants saw so much that guests never noticed. As she left the library, she met Dr. Haydock in the hall. "Well, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, "it seems your nephew-in-law is off the hook for the moment. This embezzlement business points straight at the secretary." "Perhaps," she replied. "But human nature is rarely so straightforward, Doctor. Desperation can drive a man to theft, yet stop short of murder." Dr. Haydock chuckled. "You'll be telling me next it was the butler." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "Larter has been with the family 30 years. No, I think not." She returned to Dolly's sitting room where her friend was dozing by the fire. The house felt heavy with suspicion, each occupant watching the others. The secretary's secret was out and the net appeared to be closing. Yet Miss Marple, knitting steadily in the lamplight, knew that the real truth lay deeper still, hidden, like so many things, in the small, apparently trivial details of everyday life. Chapter 6. The Tangled Web of the Past. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the gardens of Gossington Hall sparkling under a pale winter sun. Miss Marple arrived shortly after breakfast, finding Dolly Bantry in the morning room with a pile of unanswered sympathy letters. "I hardly know what to write, Jane," Dolly confessed. "Everyone is being so kind, but the police are still here, and poor Timothy Black is quite prostrated. Inspector Slack says the case against him is very strong." Miss Marple settled herself with her knitting. "Strong, perhaps, but not yet complete. There are threads that do not quite join." That morning, attention shifted decisively to Miss Evelyn Pritchard. Inspector Slack, never one to leave a stone unturned once his first theory had faltered, had taken a closer interest in her genealogical researches. In the muniment room, a small, dusty apartment lined with deed boxes and old ledgers, Miss Pritchard was summoned. The inspector laid before her the anonymous letter Miss Marple had quietly passed to him the previous day. "This is your handwriting, Miss Pritchard. We've compared it with samples from your notebook." Miss Pritchard's thin lips compressed. "Very well. Yes, I wrote it. I sent it on Christmas afternoon, having the boy from the village deliver it by hand." "And why, may I ask?" "Because justice demanded it," she replied sharply. "Colonel Hargreaves, as a young officer in Simla, behaved dishonorably. There was a woman, a widow whose husband had died in service. The colonel was executor of the will and diverted funds meant for her child. The boy was his own, though never acknowledged. I discovered the proof among family papers here. Letters, a lock of hair, a birth certificate copy. I confronted him 2 days ago. He laughed at me, said it was ancient history and no one would believe it now. So I wrote the letter, hoping to frighten him into doing right at last." Slack leaned forward. "And when that failed, you poisoned him." "Certainly not." Miss Pritchard drew herself up. "I may have wished him discomfort, but I did not kill him." On Christmas night, I was in my room by 10:30. Gladys brought me a hot water bottle at 11 and saw me reading in bed. The maid questioned again, confirmed this. Yet when Miss Pritchard's room was searched, a small tin box was found in her dressing table containing crystals labeled potassium cyanide for photographic use. She admitted it freely. I use it for intensifying old negatives when copying documents, she explained. It's been in my possession for years. The tin was sent for analysis. Enough cyanide was missing, the police chemist later reported, to account for the fatal dose. Miss Marple listened to all this with quiet attention. She had spent part of the morning in the village calling on old Mrs. Huggins, who had been lady's maid to Dolly's mother, and remembered India gossip from the 20s. "Yes, miss," Mrs. Huggins had croaked. "There was talk about young Captain Hargreaves and a Mrs. Delaney in Simla. Pretty woman, left badly off. The child was sent to relatives in Australia, I believe. Nothing proved, but tongues wagged." Back at the hall, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Haydock in the garden. "The rigidity of the body," she said thoughtfully. "You told us yesterday it suggested death between midnight and 2. Yet the Colonel's watch, did you notice, had stopped at 12:45. Haydock nodded. "Probably knocked against the chair arm as he slumped forward. Common enough. Or," said Miss Marple, "stopped deliberately to mislead." She led him to the library and pointed to the soda siphon, still untouched. "The Colonel always took soda. Always. Yet the glass held only whiskey and poison. Someone who did not know him intimately prepared that drink, or added the poison to the decanter earlier, expecting him to mix it himself." Haydock frowned. "But the secretary knew his habits perfectly." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "Which is why I doubt Mr. Black poured the fatal glass." They examined the French windows together. The mud smudge on the sill was still visible, and beneath it, on the terrace, the faint outline of those small footprints remained in a sheltered corner. "Women's shoes," Haydock murmured. "Size 5 or 6, I'd say. Miss Pritchard wore sensible low-heeled Oxfords, size 5. Mrs. Swetnam favored elegant court shoes, perhaps a size larger." In the drawing room, Mrs. Swetnam was holding court with Dolly, recounting bridge triumphs. "Poor Evelyn," she said lightly. "So intense about family skeletons. One wonders if she quite lost her temper with the Colonel." Miss Marple entered quietly and sat down. "Mrs. Swetnam," she asked, "did you happen to visit the library late on Christmas night?" Lydia Swetnam's laugh was a little too bright. "Good heavens, no. I was playing patience in the morning room until at least 1 o'clock, then straight to bed." Yet Gladys thought she heard a woman's voice raised in the library around that time. "Servants imagine things," Mrs. Swetnam replied smoothly. Or perhaps it was Evelyn, remonstrating again about her precious documents. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. Mrs. Swetnam's perfume, L'Heure Bleue, expensive and distinctive, seemed to linger faintly in the air. She had noticed the same scent in the library yesterday. The web was tangling further. Miss Pritchard had motive from the past, means in her photographic cyanide, and opportunity if her alibi was false. Mrs. Swetnam had quarreled publicly with the Colonel over cards, and her perfume placed her near the scene. Mr. Black had embezzled and burned evidence. Even Captain Ainsworth, now released but still under suspicion, had financial desperation. Yet something did not fit. The Colonel's notebook spoke of envelopes prepared for Boxing Day. His traditional gifts, perhaps containing the new codicil acknowledging the Indian heir. Had someone known of this and acted to prevent it? Miss Marple returned to the library alone. On the mantelpiece stood a row of old regimental photographs. One showed a younger Colonel Hargreaves in Simla with a group of fellow officers. Behind them, half hidden, a woman in a sun helmet. Pretty, fair-haired. She studied it for a long moment. Human nature, she reflected, did not change. Old sins cast long shadows, and greed, fear, or wounded pride could drive even the most unlikely person to murder. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. Somewhere in this house, the murderer was waiting, perhaps believing the net had settled on the wrong person. Miss Marple closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask to see the Colonel's Boxing Day envelopes. One of them, she suspected, held the final clue. Chapter 7. The Missing Envelope. The weak winter sunlight of late afternoon slanted across the library at Gossington Hall, throwing long shadows from the bookshelves onto the turkey carpet. Miss Marple sat in the Colonel's armchair, the notebook open on her lap, her fingers resting lightly on the page that spoke of envelopes prepared. She had asked Larder, with her usual gentle persistence, to bring her the Colonel's desk tidy, a handsome leather writing case that had stood on the side table near his chair. Larder, after a moment's hesitation and a glance towards Inspector Slack, who was occupied in the drawing room, had complied. Inside the case lay 6 neat white envelopes, each inscribed in the Colonel's firm, angular hand. Larder, Mrs. Eccles, Gladys, Annie, Gardner, and Boy. These were the traditional Boxing Day boxes, generous gifts of money for the staff, a custom the Colonel had always observed with a grumble about modern expectations, but which he nonetheless honored handsomely. Yet according to the notebook, there should have been 7. The Colonel had written clearly, "Envelopes prepared, truth to be told. Heir in India to receive fair share. Codicil enclosed." Miss Marple turned the envelopes over thoughtfully. Each was sealed with red wax impressed with the Colonel's signet ring. She did not break the seals. There was no need yet, but she weighed them gently in her hand. 5 felt as though they contained only banknotes. The 6th, the one addressed to Larder, was noticeably thicker, as though it held several folded sheets. She rang the bell. When Larder appeared, she asked quietly, "Did the Colonel give you any instructions about these envelopes?" "Yes, miss. He handed them to me on Christmas night, saying I was to distribute them this morning after breakfast. He said, all except the one for the boy, that's to go by post." But there were only 6. "Only 6? "Yes, miss, I thought perhaps he'd miscounted. He seemed a little distracted." Miss Marple nodded. "And was there a 7th envelope on his desk at any time?" Larder considered. "There was one other, miss, thicker, addressed to a firm of solicitors in London. He sealed it himself and put it in his pocket, saying it was for posting later." "Later," Miss Marple repeated softly. "But it was not among his effects." "No, miss, the police searched thoroughly." She thanked Larder and sat in silence for some minutes. The missing 7th envelope, the one containing the codicil acknowledging the Indian heir and no doubt altering the disposition of the estate, was the key. Someone had known of its existence and had removed it after the Colonel's death, or perhaps before. She rose and went to the French windows. The smudge of mud on the inner sill had dried to a faint brown streak. Kneeling stiffly, she was not as young as she once was, she examined it closely. Embedded in the mud was a tiny scrap of white paper, no larger than a thumbnail, bearing part of a printed letterhead. "Dawn, Solicitors." The envelope had been carried out this way, perhaps torn in haste. Miss Marple pocketed the scrap and returned to the drawing room, where the remaining guests were gathered under the watchful eye of a young constable. Inspector Slack had gone to the village to telephone his superiors. Dolly Bantry looked up hopefully. "Any progress, Jane?" "A little," Miss Marple replied. The Colonel intended to do justice to someone he had wronged long ago. That intention cost him his life. Miss Pritchard, pale but composed, said sharply. Then it was greed, pure and simple. Someone who stood to lose by the new will. Mrs. Swetnam laughed lightly. My dear Evelyn, we all stood to lose something. The Colonel was not renowned for generosity to distant relations. Timothy Black, allowed downstairs under supervision, sat hunched in a corner, his face drawn. Miss Marple addressed them all mildly. The Colonel prepared 7 envelopes. One contained a new codicil to his will. That one is missing. Whoever took it entered or left by the French windows after his death. All eyes turned to the windows. Mrs. Swetnam's hand moved involuntarily to her throat. I think, Miss Marple continued, we may soon find the missing envelope if we look in the right place. She suggested to Dolly that the summer house be searched. It stood at the end of the rose garden seldom used in winter, and its door had been found unlatched that morning by the gardener. Accompanied by Dr. Haydock and the constable, they walked across the damp lawn. Inside the little wooden building, among discarded flower pots and an old deck chair, lay a sodden white envelope half buried under dead leaves that had blown in through the open door. The wax seal was broken, the contents removed. Miss Marple picked it up carefully. The address was to Messrs. Burrows and Sons, solicitors, Lincoln's Inn Fields. On the flap, caught in the torn wax, was a single strand of fair hair. Dyed, she suspected, but originally dark. Mrs. Swetnam's hair was carefully waved and golden. Miss Pritchard's was iron gray. Yet the footprint beneath the library window had been small, and Mrs. Swetnam's feet, Miss Marple recalled, were remarkably neat. Back in the house, she asked Gladys, the housemaid, to describe once more the voice she had heard. It was high-like, miss, almost shrill. I thought it was a lady at first, but then it might have been a gentleman in a temper. Mr. Black gets ever so high when he's upset. Miss Marple nodded. Timothy Black's voice, when agitated, could indeed rise. The pieces were falling into place. The embezzler facing exposure and ruin, the missing codicil that would have disinherited the nephew but left Black's thefts still to be discovered. The late visit to the library, the small, nervous footsteps mistaken for a woman's, the envelope removed in panic and hidden imperfectly. Yet one more thing was needed. She asked Larder to fetch the Colonel's outdoor shoes from the gun room. They were size 9, heavily brogued. Then she requested Mr. Black's shoes, smaller, narrower, size 8. The mud on the soles of Mr. Black's shoes matched exactly the trace on the library sill. Mr. Black, Miss Marple said gently when they were all assembled once more. You returned to the library after your interview at 12:30, did you not? The Colonel had shown you the new codicil. You feared not only prosecution but disgrace. In desperation, you added the cyanide, taken earlier from Miss Pritchard's photographic tin, to the whiskey you knew he would drink. You stopped his watch to confuse the time, left by the French windows, and later hid the envelope. Timothy Black stared at her, then buried his face in his hands. It was only meant to make him ill, he whispered. Just ill enough to delay everything. I never thought... But the dose had been too strong. Inspector Slack, returning at that moment, took charge. The young man made a full confession. The thefts, the panic, the fatal impulse. As he was led away, Miss Marple sighed softly. Another tragedy born of weakness and fear. The Indian heir would now never receive direct acknowledgement. But the estate, passing to Captain Ainsworth, would at least escape the shadow of fraud. Human nature, she reflected, was ever the same. Chapter 8. The Quiet Before the Storm. The arrest of Timothy Black brought a subdued calm to Gossington Hall. Inspector Slack, satisfied at last with a confession in hand, departed for the police station with his prisoner, promising to return the following day for final statements. The remaining guests, no longer under suspicion, began to speak of departure. Miss Pritchard to her sister in Surrey, Mrs. Swettenham to her little house in the village, Captain Ainsworth, now fully exonerated, to London to settle his affairs. Yet Miss Marple, invited to stay for dinner by a grateful Dolly Bantry, felt no such sense of completion. She sat in the drawing-room after tea, knitting steadily, her mild blue eyes resting thoughtfully on each face in turn. Something, she felt, was not quite right. Timothy Black's confession had been tearful, almost relieved, as though a burden had been lifted. He had admitted the embezzlement, the burning of papers, the panic when shown the new codicil. He had even admitted returning to the library through the French windows to retrieve the incriminating envelope. But the poisoning, he had insisted almost passionately that he had not intended murder. "I only wanted him unconscious for a day or two," he had sobbed. "Just long enough to replace the money I'd taken. I dissolved a little of the cyanide in the whiskey. Miss Pritchard had shown me her photographic tin earlier, boasting about her old camera. I thought a small dose would make him ill. I never dreamed." Dr. Haydock, when consulted privately, had shaken his head. "Cyanide doesn't work that way, Miss Marple. Even a small dose orally is usually fatal. The man may believe he only meant illness, but the result was death." And yet, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. The untouched soda siphon still troubled her deeply. Timothy Black had worked for the Colonel for 5 years. He poured drinks daily, knew every habit. He would never have left the Colonel to drink neat whiskey. He would have added the soda himself, or at least pressed the siphon. Someone else had prepared the glass or tampered with the decanter. Someone who did not know the Colonel's precise routine. She rose quietly and slipped into the library. The room had been tidied, the fatal glass and decanter removed for evidence, but the notebook remained on the desk, and the envelopes for the staff still lay in the leather case. Miss Marple opened the notebook again. The entry about the envelopes was in the Colonel's usual bold script, but the line beneath, "Heir in India to receive fair share," was slightly uneven, as though written in haste or agitation. She turned back a page. There, almost overlooked, was a scribbled memorandum. "T-Beol confront rediscrepancies Christmas Eve. If no satisfactory explanation, dismiss and prosecute. Inform Capt. A." So the Colonel had intended to expose the embezzlement openly. Timothy Black had known he faced ruin. Yet if Black had poisoned the whiskey, why stop the watch? Why create an elaborate false time of death when his own late visit to the library already placed him there? And the missing envelope, hidden so carelessly in the summer house. A panicked man might stuff it there, yes, but a clever one would have burned it with the accounts. Miss Marple closed the book and stood by the French windows, looking out at the darkening garden. The footprints had long since vanished under rain and gardener's boots, but she could still see them in her mind, small, neat, pointed toes. Not Mr. Black's. She recalled Mrs. Swettenham's elegant shoes in the hall stand, size 6, narrow, with a little mud on one heel that morning, quickly cleaned. And the scent, L'Heure Bleue, lingering faintly whenever Mrs. Swettenham passed. Gladys the maid had heard a high, angry voice. Timothy Black's could rise when agitated, but Mrs. Swettenham's natural tone was sharp and carrying. Miss Marple returned to the drawing-room. Dinner was announced, a quiet meal of clear soup, roast pheasant, and apple tart. Conversation was careful. The weather, plans for the new year, the sad business now concluded. Captain Ainsworth, relieved and grateful, raised a glass to Dolly. "To better times, Aunt, and to Miss Marple, without whom I might still be under suspicion." Miss Marple smiled and inclined her head. After dinner, the party gathered around the fire. Mrs. Swettenham, bright and animated again, suggested a rubber of bridge. "Just to take our minds off things," she said gaily. "Evelyn, Roger, Dolly, you must play." Dolly pleaded tiredness, but Miss Pritchard agreed, and Captain Ainsworth good-naturedly made a fourth. Miss Marple watched the game with quiet interest. Mrs. Swettenham played brilliantly, her bids confident, her play swift and decisive. Yet twice she revoked, a small error quickly covered with laughter. "Dear me, how foolish," she said the second time. "The Colonel was quite right. I do sometimes lose count." Miss Marple noted how Captain Ainsworth's eyes narrowed briefly and how Miss Pritchard's lips tightened. Later, when the others had retired, Miss Marple sat with Dolly by the dying fire. "Dolly, dear," she said softly, "on Christmas night, when the Colonel accused Lydia of cheating at bridge, what exactly did he say?" Dolly frowned in recollection. "He said, 'Madam, you have revoked twice in this rubber alone. I do not play with cheats.'" It was most embarrassing. Lydia laughed it off, but she was furious. I could tell. "And the next day he was dead." Dolly stared. "You don't mean—" "I mean," said Miss Marple, "that pride can be as powerful a motive as greed, and a woman scorned publicly may nurse her resentment quietly until the moment is ripe." She rose. "Tomorrow morning, Dolly, I think we shall have a little gathering in the drawing-room. I believe the mystery is not quite finished." Dolly looked bewildered but trusting. "If you say so, Jane." Miss Marple patted her hand. "I do say so. Good night, dear." As she climbed the stairs to her room, Miss Marple felt the familiar quiet certainty settling upon her. The pieces, scent, footprints, the untouched soda, the carelessly hidden envelope, were falling into place. Timothy Black had confessed to theft and panic, but not to murder. The real killer had used his desperation, planting suspicion on the nephew first, then allowing it to settle on the secretary. Chapter 9. The revelation in the drawing-room. The following morning broke clear and cold, with a hard frost silvering the lawns of Gossington Hall. Dolly Bantry, at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, had asked the remaining house guests to gather in the drawing-room after breakfast. Captain Ainsworth, Miss Pritchard, Mrs. Swettenham, and Dr. Haydock were all present, along with Inspector Slack, who had arrived early to tie up loose ends following Timothy Black's confession. A fire crackled cheerfully in the grate, and coffee had been served. Yet an atmosphere of uneasy anticipation hung over the room. Timothy Black himself remained at the police station, his confession duly signed. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, upright in a chintz-covered chair, her knitting lying idle in her lap. She looked, as always, the picture of mild, elderly innocence, fluffy white hair, pale blue eyes, and a gentle smile. No one seeing her would have guessed the sharpness of the mind behind that tranquil facade. When everyone had assembled and coffee cups were filled, Miss Marple spoke in her soft, precise voice. "I am sure we are all relieved that poor Mr. Black has confessed to his unfortunate embezzlement," she began. "It explains so much, the burnt papers, the missing envelope, even his nervousness. And yet, there are one or two small points that still trouble me." Inspector Slack frowned. "With respect, Miss Marple, the man has admitted everything. Motive, opportunity, means. He even described taking the cyanide from Miss Pritchard's tin." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Quite so. But he did not confess to murder, Inspector. He believes, mistakenly, that he only intended to cause illness. And I am inclined to think he is telling the truth in that at least." A murmur ran round the room. Mrs. Swettenham set down her cup with a little clink. "What on earth do you mean, Miss Marple?" "I mean, Lydia dear," said Miss Marple calmly, "that Colonel Hargreaves was murdered by someone who knew enough to use cyanide, but not quite enough to understand the Colonel's habits perfectly. Someone who prepared a glass of neat whiskey, never dreaming that he would not touch it until he added soda himself." Captain Ainsworth leaned forward. "But the glass was drunk from. The poison took effect. "Exactly," said Miss Marple. The colonel, dozing in his chair after Mr. Black had left at 12:30, woke later, felt thirsty, and added soda to the whiskey already poured for him. The poison, dissolved in the neat spirit, was still lethal. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly. That would explain the timing. Rigor and stomach content suggested death nearer 2 o'clock than midnight. Miss Marple continued. The real murderer needed a scapegoat. First, the planted cyanide bottle in Captain Ainsworth's room, crude but effective for a time. Then, when suspicion shifted to poor Mr. Black because of his embezzlement, the murderer encouraged it by allowing the missing codicil envelope to be found carelessly hidden. A truly guilty man would have destroyed it utterly. All eyes turned involuntarily to Mrs. Swettenham. She gave a light laugh. "This is absurd. You surely don't suggest—" "I suggest," said Miss Marple gently, "that on Christmas night, after the unpleasant scene at bridge, you returned to the library. The colonel had accused you quite rightly of revoking not once but twice. For a proud woman who prides herself on her skill and who perhaps relies on small winnings to supplement a modest income, that accusation was intolerable." Mrs. Swettenham's cheeks flushed. "He was an ill-mannered old bully. Everyone knows that." "Indeed," said Miss Marple. "You went to the library through the French windows. Your shoes left the small, neat footprints the gardener noticed. You carried Miss Pritchard's photographic tin, which you had taken earlier from her room while she was in the muniment room. You dissolved cyanide in the whiskey already poured on the tray. The colonel often left a glass ready for his nightcap." Mrs. Swettenham's hand trembled, rattling her cup in its saucer. "You hoped," Miss Marple went on, "that suicide would be suspected, an old man alone at Christmas facing exposure of an old scandal. When that failed, you planted the bottle in Captain Ainsworth's room. And when Mr. Black's embezzlement came to light, you were content to let suspicion settle there." "Proof?" Mrs. Swettenham's voice was sharp. "You have no proof." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and drew out a small envelope. From it she produced the strand of fair hair caught in the wax of the torn envelope and the tiny scrap of paper with the solicitor's letterhead. The envelope was carried out through the French windows and hidden in the summer house. In your haste, Lydia, you tore it. This hair, dyed but matching the shade of your own, was caught in the seal, and your perfume L'Heure Bleue lingered in the library for days. Gladys heard your voice, sharp and angry, when you returned to retrieve something you had left behind. Mrs. Swettenham rose suddenly, her face pale beneath the careful makeup. "This is outrageous. I shall—" But Inspector Slack was already on his feet. "I think, madam, you had better come with me to the station. There are questions to be answered." For a moment Mrs. Swettenham stood rigid, then her shoulders sagged. Without another word, she allowed the constable to lead her away. The room was silent. Dolly Bantry looked quite dazed. "Jane," she whispered at last, "how did you know?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. "Human nature, Dolly dear. Pride and resentment are powerful motives, and small things, the untouched soda siphon, the size of the footprints, the carelessly hidden envelope, all pointed away from poor Mr. Black. He is guilty of theft, but not of murder." Captain Ainsworth cleared his throat. "Then the colonel's new codicil will probably never be found," said Miss Marple. "But the estate passes to you, Roger, free of fraud, and perhaps in time you may feel able to do justice to the Indian branch of the family yourself." The fire settled in the grate. Outside, the frost began to melt in pale sunshine. Chapter 10. Resolution over morning tea. The village of St. Mary Mead returned to its customary peace within a day or two, as though the shadows of murder had never darkened Gossington Hall. Mrs. Swettenham's arrest caused a sensation that rippled through the shops and cottages for a week, But village life has its own gentle rhythm, and by the new year the talk had turned to the church heating fund and the prospects for early crocuses. Miss Marple sat in her own neat sitting room on a bright January morning, the frost sparkling outside her window. Dolly Bantry had come to take tea, wrapped in a warm fur coat and carrying a large seed catalogue as an excuse for the visit. "Jane, my dear," she said as she settled into the most comfortable chair, "I still can't quite believe it. Lydia Swettenham of all people, she always seemed so gay and harmless." Miss Marple poured tea with careful precision, strong for Dolly, weaker for herself, and handed a cup on its flowered saucer. "Harmless people can be the most dangerous, Dolly, when their pride is touched." Lydia had lived for years on her reputation as an accomplished bridge player. Small stakes, of course, but enough to supplement her income and keep her in pretty clothes and little luxuries. The Colonel's public accusation struck at the heart of that carefully built world. Dolly stirred her tea thoughtfully, and all because she revoked twice. "More than twice, I suspect," said Miss Marple mildly. "Over the years, perhaps a pattern." The Colonel, with his soldier's eye for detail, noticed and spoke out. For Lydia, it was humiliation in front of the very people whose good opinion she valued. Resentment grew, and when she learned, from overhearing the Colonel speak to Mr. Black, of the new codicil that might bring strangers into the inheritance, she saw her chance to settle the score and perhaps profit later through Captain Ainsworth's gratitude. Dolly shuddered. "Poison, though, it's so cold-blooded." "Cyanide is quick, at least," Miss Marple replied, and Lydia convinced herself it would look like suicide or natural causes. When it did not, she turned suspicion first on Roger, then allowed it to settle on poor Mr. Black, whose guilt over the embezzlement made him confess to more than he had done. "Will he be prosecuted for the theft?" "Oh yes, I imagine so. But the sentence will be lighter knowing he did not commit murder. And Captain Ainsworth has undertaken to repay what was taken, so the estate suffers little." Dolly helped herself to a slice of seed cake. "Roger telephoned yesterday. He's going to India in the spring, to trace the Colonel's other family if he can. He feels it's the right thing to do." Miss Marple's eyes softened. A decent young man beneath the surface charm. Responsibility will steady him. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the tick of the grandmother clock in the hall and the distant sound of children playing in the lane. "And the house, Jane? Will I ever feel comfortable in that library again?" Miss Marple smiled. "Put a bowl of potpourri on the table and new chintz covers on the chairs. Memories fade surprisingly quickly when surrounded by everyday comforts." Dolly laughed. "You make everything sound so simple." "Most things are once one understands the human heart," said Miss Marple. "Greed, fear, wounded pride, they wear different faces, but they are the same old acquaintances I have met many times before, here in St. Mary Mead and elsewhere." Dolly finished her tea and rose to go. "You'll come to lunch next week? Just us and the vicar, no mysteries, I promise." "I should like that very much." At the door they embraced, and Dolly stepped out into the crisp air. Miss Marple watched her walk briskly down the path, then returned to her chair by the fire. She picked up her knitting, a warm scarf in soft blue wool, and resumed her steady, unhurried stitches. Outside, the winter sun climbed higher, melting the frost into tiny sparkling drops on the hedgerows. The village went about its quiet business. The butcher's boy on his bicycle, the postman with his letters, Mrs. Harmon at the vicarage planning the next Women's Institute meeting. Another mystery had come and gone, leaving only a faint ripple on the surface of village life. Miss Marple knitted on, serene and watchful, knowing that human nature, in all its frailty and occasional kindness, would always provide fresh patterns to observe.